good evening, distinguished scholars, teachers, and esteemed guests. I'm Sana Bashir, pursuing Masters in English, and it is with great pleasure to be here as your host this evening. It is with great pleasure and intellectual fervor that I welcome you to the highly anticipated National Interdisciplinary Online Students Conference under the aegis of the Raleigh Literary Festival. In the upcoming session, we have the privilege of delving into the depths of knowledge through the exploration of some of the most captivating discussions under the theme of history. Each presentation will shed light on diverse aspects of literature, trauma, memory, identity, and history. We have the following presenters lined up for the upcoming conference. Harshit Singh, he's from Jadavpur University, and he will be presenting the paper on trauma and memory in the fiction of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a comparative study of Half a Yellow Sun and Americana. Next up, we have Debeshi Mandal. She's from Jadavpur University, and she will be presenting the paper on rehabilitation through language, generational trauma, and Vietnamese American identity in On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous. Next up, we have Ananya Annapurna. She's from Symbiosis Law School, Noida, and she'll be presenting the paper on intersectionality of trauma, identity, and memory in marginalized communities. Next, we have Siganda Srivastava, and she'll be presenting the paper on rummaging lost identities of partition through fiction. And lastly, we have Sarbondaya Haldar, and he's from Shivandar Institute of Eminence, and he'll be presenting the paper on foreign correspondence reports and the journalistic gaze, interrogating the representation of Sepoy Mutiny 1857 by the Times. Memory, post-memory, and trauma are interconnected aspects of our personal and collective experiences. Memory holds our past, but trauma can fragment and distort it. Traumatic events can lead to post-memory, where memories are inherited and transmitted across generations. Understanding these connections helps us navigate our shared history and promote healing and understanding for the future. This evening, we have the distinct honor of being joined by a very special guest who brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our discussion. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Lubna Irfan. Dr. Lubna Irfan is a researcher who worked as an assistant professor of history at Women's College, AMU, for 2 years. She is currently working as an assistant professor at AMU, Malappuram Center. She has recently been awarded thesis on the topic Secular Public Utility Buildings of North India from 1200 to 715 AD. And she has participated in a number of national and international conferences and has a number of publications to her credit. Her recent paper, Nature of Slavery and Servitude in Mughal India, has been published in the journal South Asia History and Culture 2022. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence and taking the time to join us. Your insights and perspectives are highly valued, and we are eager to delve into discussion with your guidance. We'll now move ahead with the program, and we have 5 thought-provoking papers lined up for the conference. Each presenter will be given 12 minutes to present their paper, which will then be followed by a remark and a question-answer session, allowing us to engage in fruitful discussions and seek further clarification on the ideas presented, and then we'll move on to the next presenter. Throughout this conference, we will witness a series of presentations by esteemed speakers from across the country who have poured their expertise and efforts into their research papers. We commence our conference with the first paper titled Trauma and Memory in the Fiction of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a comparative study by Harshit Singh. This comparative study delves into the representation of trauma and memory in Adichie's renowned novels Half a Yellow Sun and Americana.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I hope I'm visible as well. I'll just share my screen very quickly. Just if possible, could you please confirm once my screen is visible?
Yes, the presentation is visible.
Okay. So, hi everyone. I'm Harshit Singh, and I'm gonna present a paper which is basically a comparative study between 2 novels of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. They're Half of a Yellow Sun and Americana. Now, before we begin, I would just like, due to the time constraint, I would like to present the paper very quickly. But before we do that, I just like to move very quickly through the methodology and why I chose these two texts, which are in the genre of fiction, to convey something so socially and politically relevant as memory, as trauma, and as history. Right. So these literary masterpieces. That are Half of a Yellow Sun and Americana, uh, they, in a way, sort of transport us into the lives of very unforgettable characters, immersing us in their personal struggles and triumphs while shedding light on the complexities of our shared human experiences. Now, fiction. The role of fiction while representing history, while representing the people that have lived through a certain moment, a certain event of in history, and how they are moving forward. Fiction there serves as a sort of a conduit that connects personal experiences to the broader historical landscape, shedding light onto the intricate interplay between individual lives and societal dynamics, amplifying marginalized voices and overlooked stories. It is essential to recognize fiction's capacity to challenge dominant historical narratives as well, prompting a very critical re-evaluation of the past. Through alternative perspectives and the inclusion of diverse lived experiences, fiction enables a more comprehensive understanding of history and of historical lived experiences. For example, Professor Siddiqui in the opening lecture of this conference talked about Manto and partition, right? And within the realm of literature, fiction provides a very fertile space for the exploration and reconstruction of memory. Like, if we were to reimagine the author and the writer as a skilled painter, the writer here delicately weaves together fragments of memory, um, that are, different events are of different colors, have different strokes, and they together create a mosaic of perspectives that surpasses the limitations of traditional historical accounts. Now, the finally, the transformative power of fiction is very important. It extends beyond the individual reader, beyond the rooms, the four walls that we read a book in. It goes on to shape societal discourses and fosters profound conversations by evoking certain emotions and challenging preconceptions and prompting critical reflection. Fiction here becomes a catalyst for intellectual growth and the development of a more inclusive and nuanced collective memory. Now, first, in Half of the Yellow Sun, Adichie skillfully portrays the fragmented nature of memory and trauma. The novel is based in the background of the Biafran War in Nigeria, which was a civil war from 1967 to 70. Uh, and the narrative structure of the novel is non-linear, it's fragmented, and it sort of mirrors the shattered memories and the traumatic experiences of the characters. The very way the novel is written and the very narrative technique the author uses, the very book as a material object as well as the content that it represents, it sort of becomes a very own character in the story, in the narrative, and how political and politically relevant the content of the book is. Adichie's techniques sort of allow us to witness the lasting effects of trauma on individuals and communities who grapple with fragmented senses of self and a disconnection from their past. Now, this fragmentation resonates with the broader historical context of the Biafran War, where violence and political upheaval, basically majorly of the Igbo community, disrupted a lot of lives and shattered collective memory of sorts. For example, we see this in the novel, the way the novel is written in, the protagonists, the main characters, Olana and Ugu. We are introduced to the story between their alternative perspectives. Their individual experiences and memories sort of intertwine and reveal the multifaceted nature and a subjective understanding of the impacts of the Afghan war, which were removed from the, which gave an alternate understanding of the war beyond the political and the historical and the social relevance. We get to see the individual impact that these things have. Now, in the novel, the narrator quotes this very beautiful line that we lived in a world in which the end seemed imminent, and each passing day carried the weight of our shared traumas and memories. The second novel in this comparative study is Americana, which deals with a very different subject, but deals it in a very similar manner. It deals with the theme of migration from Nigeria to America and its impact on the individual's memory and identity. Now, the novel delves into the profound loss experienced by individuals and who are uprooted from their homeland, and the subsequent challenges of preserving cultural memory and heritage in foreign lands. Adichie highlights the complexities of memory and identity, illustrating how individuals navigate the politics of place and the tensions between their post-colonial heritage and the globalized identities. So these are people that have a post-colonial, a heritage, trauma, and a sort of a legacy that they have to continue they have to live on with, but they are also in these first world countries, in these globalized communities, that the interplay of these two identities, the interplay of these two uh, contexts intertwine and play a very important role in the novel. Now, through the characters' experiences, we gain a deeper understanding of the intricacies of cultural displacement and the profound effects it has on personal and collective memory. If, for example, the Ifemelu, the protagonist in the novel, has a very transformative and a very, a shocking episode in the novel, in the beginning of the novel, when upon arriving in the United States, she goes to a hair salon, and just the sheer unfamiliarity with American culture, American hair care practices, and particularly the racial implications of a natural hair, and how she appears to others, how she's perceived by others. It very in a very microcosmic manner embodies the challenges and complexities faced by African American uh, individuals and African immigrants in navigating a foreign cultural landscape. This is also important because in this day and age, a lot of Indian people are migrating. We are, for the first time, getting out. The common people are seeing and interacting with, these foreign lands. So it's really enlightening. And Ifemilu, the protagonist herself, she has this very moving uh, soliloquy where she says that when once you leave your own country, something inside you leaves with you. A pride, a sense of belonging, a shared cultural context, a network of relationships. And all of this must be painfully reconstructed in a new and foreign place. Now, Adichie employs
Sir, it's a gentle reminder that we have to wind up your session within 2 minutes.
Now, Adichie employs various narrative techniques and motives to bridge the gaps between personal and collective history and memory. And these dual narrative perspectives alternating between personal accounts and historical events, they allow us to witness this interplay that I've just talked about. Now, in addition, there are symbolic motifs such as photographs, letters, and personal artifacts that serve as very powerful devices that evoke memory and deepen our understanding of the character's experiences. Right? Moving on, these novels also delve into the ways the post-globalization communities grapple with the post-colonial memory and trauma. Adichie expands upon our understanding of identity beyond national boundaries, highlighting the formation of deeper connection and negotiation of legacies of colonialism The characters' experiences reflect the tensions and challenges of cultural hybridity as they navigate their post-colonial heritage in the context of a globalized world. Finally, the concluding understanding from these texts we gain is the healing process, which in the context of trauma and memory is sort of a backward looking onward project, right? You look back to your trauma, you confront it, and then move forward, uh, in an attempt to heal yourself. The healing process and the addressing of wounds from the past are significant themes that tie together Adichie's writings and expressions of narration and identity. She portrays the transformative power of storytelling, artistic expression, and activism as very crucial avenues for healing and for storytelling. Through interpersonal relationships and community support, characters find solace and strength to confront and overcome their trauma. For example, Kaneen in Half of a Yellow Sun, after a long period of emotional withdrawal following the war, embarks on a humanitarian mission to assist displaced persons, allowing her to find a purpose in this, post-war existential crisis and reclaim agency in the field of a devastating aftermath of the conflict. This episode it brings to light the transformative power of engaging with the pain and the trauma of the past through acts of compassion and service. I'd like to conclude my presentation there, since I think my time is up. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm open to questions now.
Thank you, Harshit, for such an intriguing and interesting paper. I hope I'm audible to all of you.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Okay. Okay, that's great. So before giving a few remarks and asking a few questions of my own, I would expect the audience, the listeners here to come forward first and put up their questions to the presented paper. Okay. Anyway, I hope while I'm giving my comments and asking clearing a few things with Harshit over the presentation that he has made, I hope some of you can come up with certain questions which you would like to ask to this very interesting paper that was presented to you. Harshit, I have just a few questions regarding the literary text, the first literary text that you utilized in your presentation. What is the time lapse or the time gap between the writing of that book, of that novel, and the actual war that took place? So because I am unfamiliar with this literature and I am very interested and intrigued, because in history we are very concerned with how much time has passed, or how much apart is the literary work from the actual event that has taken place, because that also contributes a lot in which the past is represented, right? Because the kind of distortion, the kind of more how time and how the events are molded in your mind over a period of time, that also is very significant. So, and the second thing is, you're talking about alternative perspectives that are presented in the first novel of the protagonist. So if you can explain that bit a little.
So am I audible? Right. So for the first question, I personally am very intrigued by Adichie as a person and as a writer as well. So the war took place in 1967 to 70, and the book was published. It was written in the early 2000 and published in 2006. So the majority of the influx of the context and the manner of understanding of the war came from official records, listening to people in her family, in her community, because she's from Nigeria and the war took place in Nigeria. And I, as a part of like my putting together this paper, I listened to some of the interviews, and she said this one thing, that she felt the need to tell the story from the perspective of the people, because all of the perspectives were from the how the government undertook the Biafran conflict. But yeah, so that was how she went about writing that. I hope that answers the first question.
Yes, thank you.
The second question, Could you please repeat the second question?
I asked, you said there were alternative perspectives that were presented
Oh, right.
within
Yeah.
that narrative. So, what
Yeah.
kind of alternative? How would you explain that?
So the Biafran War, it was very at the time it was happening as well. It was very underrepresented in global media, and because this was also before, prior to globalization and prior to the internet. So when it was happening, so the narrative that Adichie had to work with was a very mainstream narrative. In the novel, she uses multiple characters, like the first person narrative, a narrative that she uses belongs to different people in different chapters, which is very crucial because it talks about how the war has impacted different people and how different people think about the war that is taking place and how it is significant to their community, right? So there are people like there are women characters who are more concerned with their families, about their families, about how they're going to go about this thing, and there are male characters who are, very chauvinistic and very nationalist. So we have to go about this, we have to do the war, we have to participate in it. And there are characters like Kaneen, who is more focused on, okay, my family was uprooted, so were other people, I need to help them, and that's how she heals. So that is that are alternative perspectives that are often looked over. Obviously, Adichie has, she clarified that she fictionalized a lot of things, but then again, it was also her manner of dealing with the past of her country and of her culture.
Okay, Harshit. Thank you so much. Has anybody developed is there any questions that you want to ask now? Anybody? Asana, can you just see and moderate if there is anybody who would be interested in asking questions?
If anyone in the audience is interested in asking the questions, they can put up in the chat box, or they can personally unmute themselves and ask the question.
Okay, I'll just make a few suggestions also, Harshit. Thank you for clarifying the points. The first thing is because in the entire presentation you were talking about you were doing a comparative study between the two texts, right? The lines on which you are comparing them, apart from them being written by the same author and addressing the issues of Nigerian community, what are the grounds or what are the lines on which you are comparing these two texts, right? Because comparative study needs to mean a lot more than just a text. I hope you are understanding what I'm trying to say. Just two texts written by the same person. You need to dwell a little more.
I actually had
Yeah.
one whole paragraph that I had to, omit for because of the time, because
Okay.
I got the wrong.
I understand.
But
So
it's there
yeah,
in the
okay. Okay, that explains it, because in comparative study you need to do a bit more, and I hope you have done that in your paper and you will explore that a little more. And one text that I'm reminded of is Atonement. I'm sure you must have read it, by Ian McEwan. It is also, but obviously again it is about the major war, the Great War that happened, which was engaging the first world countries mainly, and it was being fought, and the subjects that are being addressed are, say, the Americans or the British. And here you're looking at literature that has been composed from a different perspective, from a different for a different war, which was hardly noticed by people, but it also had the similar impact that probably the First World War, Second World War had. So thank you so much, Harshit, for such an amazing presentation. I really hope that there would have been some questions, but nevertheless, let's move forward, Sana.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am, for presenting your valuable insights. Moving forward, I would like to welcome our second presenter, Deveshi Mandal, who will present a paper titled Rehabilitation Through Language, Generational Trauma and Vietnamese American Identity in On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you. Wait a minute, I'll just try presenting it. Is my presentation visible?
Yes, yes, it's visible now.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, I'm Debeshi, and I'm going to be presenting my paper titled Rehabilitation Through Language, Generational Trauma, and Vietnamese American Identity in Honor We're Briefly Gorgeous. So I want to start my paper with the literary verbalization of trauma. The literary imagination has the ability to fictionalize and symbolize experiences that appear to defy understanding and verbalization. Therefore, the language of fiction can create a space in which events and experiences steeped in trauma and vulnerability can be explored from multiple perspectives. The fictional world of literary texts allows for nuanced engagements with the subject of trauma, which is often personalized and contextualized, fictionalized and historicized, as well as psychologized and metaphorized at the same time. According to psychoanalyst Dory Lobb, in an event without a witness, truth, testimony, and survival, I quote, the survivors did not only need to survive so they could tell their story, they also needed to tell their story in order to survive. In his 2019 debut novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, Ocean Vuong uses storytelling as a survival mechanism. He tries to understand his personal and familial trauma and to break free from it through the act of putting it down in writing. The speaker, Little Dog, traces his family's journey from Vietnam to America. He writes of the war that left permanent scars on his mother and his grandmother, and how that war is still inside them because, quote, once it enters you, it never leaves. End quote. And how he has inherited that war as well through his mother's violent blows and his grandmother's bedtime stories of napalm clouds swallowing entire villages. The transgenerational nature of communal trauma is stressed upon throughout the narrative. As a part of a younger generation born after the conclusion of the Vietnam War, Vuong does not have direct experience with the atrocities that his grandmother and his mother have faced. Yet, he is still heavily burdened with the historical experience of his ancestors. Once he wonders if his mother's wartime experiences make her hit him, because parents suffering from PTSD are more likely to hit their children. Thus, his mother repeats the violence that she cannot come to terms with, the violence that still haunts her. In this way, the past is perpetuated in the collective imagination of the community, haunting the present and the future. Quote, perhaps to lay hand on your child is to prepare him for war. End quote. The narrator concludes, establishing that he cannot escape the memories of the war, although he is not a first-hand witness to it. However, narrating his own and his community's traumatic experiences allows him to continuously strive to learn and to memorize these events and thereby come to terms with what actually happened. Learning this knowledge through writing in turn empowers him and helps him affirm his identity as a Vietnamese immigrant in America, an identity which came into being as a direct consequence of the Vietnam War. When the collective trauma of a community is narrativized to a personal testimony, such as that of Little Dogs, it is extended into a larger narrative where Vuong, as a storyteller, serves as a mediator and cultural translator of the past. Such a narrative, therefore, does not only concern Vuong as an individual, but also as a representative of a social class or group. In Trauma and Survival in Contemporary Fiction, published in 2002, Laurie Vicroy stresses that channeling trauma through fiction, quote, is an important way of witnessing or testifying for the history and experience of historically marginalized people, end quote. Next, let us move to the weaponization of language and its reversal in the novel. The novel is structured as a son's letter to a mother who cannot read English, a mother who moves further away from him with each English word he addresses to her. And yet, this language is the very vehicle he chooses to reach her, to make sense of everything that she has passed down to him, her love and her trauma. In The Burning of Paper Instead of Children, Adrian Rich writes that, quote, this is the oppressor's language, yet I needed to talk to you. End quote. Little Dog assumes the same stance as he writes to his mother in English, a language she barely understands but he uses while trying to break free. He uses the language that he has adopted as his own in order to assimilate his family into the American fold, to understand his own identity as a Vietnamese American queer man, and his complex relationship with his mother. Thus, the language that has hitherto been used to alienate him becomes a tool for his intersectional identity to gain visibility instead. Early in his childhood, Little Dog is bullied by white American children with constant taunts of speak English. But after several incidents where his mother and his grandmother Lance's inability to speak or understand English leaves them vulnerable and confused in an America that has no intentions of accepting them, Little Dog decides to become the family's official interpreter. Wong writes, quote, I took off our language and wore my English like a mask, so that others would see my face and therefore yours. Therefore, the language that has until then been used as a weapon to alienate his identity as an immigrant becomes a mouthpiece for the Vietnamese community instead. The push and pull between the oppressor's language and one's own is manifested in various other instances throughout the novel. When Little Dog comes out to his mother, he finds himself at a loss for words because, quote, Vietnamese did not have a name for queer bodies, end quote, before the French occupation. As a result, the commonly used term for queer or homosexual in Vietnamese was pede, short for pedophile. Loath to reveal his queer identity to his mother using an epithet for criminals, Little Dog blurts out that he does not like girls instead. The French colonization of Vietnam had thus criminalized the identity of queer Vietnamese individuals through the use of language. However, Vuong consciously refuses to use the colonizer's language in this crucial moment of his coming out, reclaiming both his queer and Vietnamese identity in the process. Lastly, I would like to talk about the collapse of language in the text. In opposition to Lob's previously mentioned theorization about survivors' compulsion to tell their stories, there exists a tendency that Lob coins, quote, the impossibility of telling, end quote. This refers to the impossibility of articulating something that cannot be fully captured in thought, memory, or speech. The impossibility of telling is reflected in the repeated collapse of Vuong's prose into poetry, in moments of extreme vulnerability that refuse to be contained in the medium of prose alone. While trying to make sense of all his mother's contradictions in the third part of the text, Little Dog's narration breaks off into a series of disjointed vignettes and memories. I quote, the truth is, none of us are enough, but you know that already. The truth is, I came here hoping for a reason to stay. Sometimes those reasons are small, the way you pronounce spaghetti as baguette. It's late in the season, which means the winter roses in full bloom along the National Bank are suicide notes. Write that down. They say nothing lasts forever, but they're just scared it will last longer than they can love it. Are you there? Are you still walking? They say nothing lasts forever, and I'm writing to you in the voice of an endangered species. The truth is, I'm afraid they will get us before they get us. Tell me where it hurts. You have my word. This is one example of the way that Vuong's prose breaks down into poetry in various parts of the novel. This disintegration of prose into
Ma'am, it's a
poetry
gentle
is not.
reminder that you have to wind up your presentation within 2 minutes.
Yes, I'm almost done. So, this disintegration of prose into poetry is not only symbolic of the enormity of the narrator's trauma, but also a direct consequence of it. Language, under the strain of trauma and violence, literally falls apart. Trauma theorist Cathy Caruth echoes this sentiment when she states that, quote, trauma demands a mode of representation that textually performs trauma and its incomprehensibility through gaps and silences, the repeated breakdown of language, and the collapse of understanding. To conclude, Literary verbalization becomes a basis for Vuong to make generational trauma perceivable and his identity as a Vietnamese American queer man visible. He constantly deconstructs and redefines his relationship with language, transforming it into a tool that thematizes the systematic violence that has been inflicted upon Vietnamese immigrants in America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debishi. Again, a very interesting paper. And while I expect the audience to articulate their own questions and comments about the presentation, I will start with my own comments and maybe one or two question like comments. This text that you are looking at, what and I understood from your presentation, Deveshi, is that there is a consciousness, there's a conscious recording of or you can say that there's a conscious attempt at recording historical events and the consequences of those historical events. Do you see any consciousness of leaving that text and whatever literature is being composed by the author as a record for the future? Because his identity, his existence is a very important landmark in Vietnamese history, and this work might be looked at by the future Vietnamese people when they're looking back. So is there any consciousness that you observe in within the text around these lines?
Yes, definitely. I think that the way Vuong presents his familial history, his family's history, as a record of the war itself is very important. Like a lot of the novel is set in flashbacks of the war, memories of the war that those are not his own memories, but things that his mother and his grandmother have told him. And these serve as a direct record of the war. So yes, this will be a landmark.
Exactly, Divish. And one interesting thought that came to me, I'm just sharing it with you. You can explore on those lines. Is that why is he writing in English? I understand that he wants to be visible to the American audience, right? That is why he's using the language, but he's also addressing his mother who does not understand the language. So my the thing that I would want to submit to you is that is he trying to subvertly or inherently express his resentment against his abusive mother by writing to her in a language that she does not understand, by communicating with her and also not communicating with her at the same time? Because when you use a particular language, there would be certain expressions, certain emotions that would not be able to be expressed in English and would have been expressed much more purely in their vernacular language. So is there do you see that if that is an expression of his resentment, or are there evidences in the text that suggest otherwise?
He definitely has a very complex relationship with his mother, and one might definitely interpret it that way, his decision to write in English. But also, there's this part in this text that I'll share about. The Vietnamese that has been passed down to Vuong, that is also not a very complete Vietnamese. So in the text, we see his mother's memory. So the thing is, his mother did not complete her primary school education because the school was bombed during the Vietnamese War. So Vuong says that the Vietnamese that has been passed down to him is a very broken and incomplete Vietnamese as well. So I think that is also a reason that he chose to write in English.
Interesting. And again, a comment on how his Vietnamese is broken, and that can be as a metaphor for his own existence, his own identity as a broken, half Vietnamese, half American, belonging nowhere, hanging there in the limbo. So that kind of identity. Interesting. Thank you, Dibeshi, for clearing that out. Are there any questions for this particular paper? Sana? There is one I can see in the chat box.
Yes, there is one question. It is the question is by Anam Kazi.
Yeah, so you're asking about if that exists in post-colonial India. So the question is,
The question is, I'll say the question. I'll ask the question. You talked about weaponization of language. Do you think that exists in post-colonial India, or have we become simply passive to the English language?
I think that definitely exists. Like, I don't think we have become passive to English language. For example, Indian poets or novelists who are writing in English, they're taking a very conscious decision to write in the colonizer's language. It is not simply because they're submitting to English. Because English is also colonial legacy that has been, that has become a part of our lives. Like right now we are in a literary festival where all of us are talking in English and discussing English texts, so it's not simply like we have become passive to it. It has also become a part of our lives at this point, I believe.
I'd like to add here, since you people are all students of literature and I'm from history, but I'm sure you people are aware about the concept of Indian English and how English has been like writers like Arundhati Roy or Jhumpa Lahiri who are writing in English, but it is very Indian English. So Indian English, maybe you can read upon that, Anam, and that will also help you in navigating that question.
Yeah, also about Indian English. So I was recently reading a text. It's a historical novel called Cuckold by Kiran Nagarkar. So in that text, he uses a lot of terms, a lot of Hindi terms, a lot of vernacular terms, but he does not italicize any of them. So he uses them as if they are a part of the English language itself, or he does not consciously try to strike them out as Indian words. So when I saw a lot of reviews by Westerners, foreigners, so they were like, I had to look up these words. So they were struggling as well. So like Indian writers are trying to build a canon of their own, I believe, in English. So
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. We set
thank you
forth
so
to
much.
we set forth towards our fourth presenter, authored by Snigdha Srivastava, titled Rummaging Lost Identities of Partition Through Fiction.
Excuse me. I think I was the third presenter.
Sana, there's one presenter in between, third presenter, presenting on trauma, identity, and memory, I think,
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
for the
ma'am. That's me.
marginalized communities. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, just give me a minute. Okay, we have Ananya Annapurna, and she'll be presenting the paper titled The Intersectionality of Trauma, Identity, and Memory in Marginalized Communities. I'm
Uh,
really sorry for the inconvenience caused.
no worries. Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Um, just a second. I hope my PowerPoint is visible.
Yes, it is now.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone, and my topic is the intersectionality of trauma, identity, and memory in marginalized communities. So until now, a lot of my fellow presenters have presented about some have based a presentation on a form of literature, but this is a purely research-based paper. Allow me to give an overview of the paper. This research explores the intricate relationship between trauma, identity, and memory within marginalized communities. It delves into the complexities and nuances that arise when these three elements intersect, and it sheds light on the profound impact that they have on individuals and collectives. It is important to explore this intersectionality of trauma, identity, and memory so as to deepen our understanding of the dynamics at play within marginalized communities. It underscores the importance of acknowledging and comprehending these complexities so that the processes of healing and social justice can be put into motion. Uh, my research aims to investigate the complex interplay of trauma, identity, and memory within marginalized communities, and it examines how these elements intersect and influence individual and collective experiences. It is, according to me, this is very relevant in understanding how different forms of oppression and discrimination shape the experiences and outcomes of trauma survivors from diverse backgrounds and contexts. For example, how racism, sexism, and classism affect the vulnerability to and perception of different people and also the recovery from trauma. So it helps us understand operation trauma linkages across different contexts. It can also help us develop more culturally sensitive and responsive interventions and policies that address the specific needs of these trauma survivors from marginalized communities. It can also help us to challenge the dominant narratives and assumptions about trauma and its effects that may exclude or erase the voices and perspectives of marginalized communities. As my research question, I asked the question, how does the intersectionality of trauma, identity, and memory manifest within marginalized communities, and what are the implications for individual and collective experiences? My objectives are to examine trauma, identity, memory interplay in marginalization, to explore trauma's influence on memory and identity, to investigate collective memory and historical consciousness in the role of collective memory and historical consciousness. I also look forward to uncover collective memory's resistance and empowerment potential, to provide new insights, frameworks, evidence on intersectionality, to contribute to social justice, equality, and inclusivity discourse, and to inspire further research and inquiry on intersectionality. If all goes well, the findings of this research will have the potential to contribute to theoretical frameworks and practical interventions. We can deepen our understanding of intersectionality of trauma, identity, and memory, and we can inform the development of targeted support systems, therapy approaches, and community-based initiatives that address the unique needs and challenges which are faced by especially the marginalized individuals and other marginalized groups. The research methodology for the study of the intersectionality of trauma, identity, and memory in marginalized communities involve a mixed method approach to gain a comprehensive understanding of the topic. In this, I have included Funkenstein's notions of memory and historical consciousness, Nora's concept of loi de mémoire, Turdimann's examination of trauma, history, and memory, Lacapra's notions of trauma and identity, Confino's exploration of collective memory and cultural history. Funkenstein's notions of memory and historical consciousness, if I put this literature review into one sentence, it would be that he argues that memory is not a passive repository of the past, but it is an active process which continues on and on to construct a coherent narrative. Nora's concept of loi de mémoire, or states of memory, is instrumental in understanding how collective memory is embedded in physical and symbolic places. Turdimann's examination of trauma, history, and memory talks about the complex relationship that trauma, history, and memory have. He states that trauma disrupts the continuity between memory and history and leads to fragmented identities and persistent memories that resist closure. Lacapra's notions of trauma and identity emphasize the intricate interplay between trauma, memory, and identity. Confino's exploration of collective memory and cultural history talks about the ways in which memory is shaped, contested, and represented within marginalized communities and with respect to different cultural contexts. His work underscores the importance of recognizing the diverse narratives and experiences of marginalized communities and while challenging dominant and historical narratives, he promotes a more inclusive understanding of history. Along with literature review, I have also included case studies, case studies. The first one is the interplay of trauma, identity, memory in refugee communities, the source of which is by Johnson Smith and Johnson R., in which the case study examines how trauma affects the identities and memories of refugees and the struggles that they face in creating a coherent self-narrative. and Historical Trauma, Memory, and Indigenous Identity, another case law by White Eagle R. and Johnson M., which talks about healing the wounds of the past, and it highlights the enduring impact of colonization, forced assimilation, and cultural genocide on the collective memory and identity of indigenous people. The study emphasizes the importance of culturally appropriate healing approaches that acknowledge the intersectionality of trauma, memory, and identity and promote the revitalization of indigenous culture, knowledge, and their traditions. These are possible conclusions that I hope to arrive at the end of my research. That trauma, the identity, and memory shape marginalized experiences and narratives. The complex interplay of trauma, identity, and memory within marginalized communities significantly shape their experiences, narratives, and highlights the importance of and I hope to highlight the importance of considering the intersectionality of these factors in understanding marginalized populations. The second conclusion that I hope to reach at is that trauma disrupts memory and identity, creating haunting memories. It can disrupt the continuity and coherence of personal and collective memories. Marginalized communities use collective memory for resistance and empowerment. Trauma identity and memory affect marginalized well-being, healing, and justice. And more research is required on trauma, identity, and memory intersectionality. With this, I end the presentation on my research paper. Thank you.
Ananya, thank you so much for the presentation. What I could gather from your presentation is that this is probably a working paper on which you are still developing.
Yes,
I just have like a few suggestions because it was quite generalized, the presentation, and a better like if you want to develop this paper, a better way would be to also include examples. For example, I understand that you took two of the case studies, right?
yes, ma'am.
We could have gone more into the details of those case studies, maybe, or
Okay,
since you're
ma'am.
working with the marginalized communities or you're talking about the marginalized communities, you could have, say, engaged or surveyed any of the marginalized communities that you have come across or that you see around you. Because I think in your abstract it was mentioned that you're looking at gender marginalization on the basis of gender and sexual
Yes, ma'am.
marginalization. So you could have worked with, say, the transgenders, or
Mm-hmm.
women, and how they are going about this, what kind of narrative is developing there, what kind of trauma. You can choose one event, one incident, and then you can develop from there. So I hope you go ahead and conduct certain surveys and also engage with the marginalized communities around you. This would definitely contribute more to your presentation, which was very interesting, and which
Okay,
will
ma'am.
also help you better develop the arguments. Yeah, I
Thank you,
think
ma'am.
I'll open the floor for questions. That was my humble submission. Thank you, Ananya.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now move on towards our fourth presenter, authored by Snigdha Srivastava, titled Oh, wait. I think we have a question. We have a question from Harshit Singh. He wants
I
to
think you
say,
should take the question.
yeah. He wants to ask what extent surrounding the Rohingya refugee crisis in India, for example. He asked to feel free to pick up any other example. Would Todi Mann's or Nora's conceptualizations contribute to the construction and preservation of a collective narrative of displacement, trauma, and identity formation? You can read up the question from the chat box.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So basically, Tournament talks about the ghosts of. Just give me a second. Yeah, so he talks about the ghosts of history, and he talks about um, how because of trauma, continuity of memory and history is fragmented. That can be very relevantly used in the case of Rohingya refugee crisis, because they do not have a nationality anymore. They do not know what their identity is. They cannot identify themselves as from a certain nation. They cannot identify themselves as from Myanmar, and they are basically stateless people. And Turdimant's concept can be applied on any stateless people because because of their fragmented identity, they are unable to identify themselves with any nation. Along with that, Nora's conceptualization can also contribute to acknowledge the traumatic experiences that have been faced by Rohingya crisis. Because in the case of Rohingya crisis, the loi de memoire could include refugee camps, community centers, or places of worship where Rohingya refugees gather and preserve their memories, culture, and sense of identity. So while Turdimant's concept will explain why their identity is becoming fragmented, what is and how their memories are becoming fragmented. Pierre Nora's concept of loi de memoire would give new places or sites of memory, which will add to which will add to help to them to preserve memory, culture, and the sense of identity. Yeah. So that's it.
Okay, thank you. We set forth towards our fourth presenter now, authored by Snigdha Srivastava, titled Rummaging Lost Identities of Partition Through Fiction.
Hello everyone, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I'm so sorry that my webcam has broken down and it would, I think I wouldn't be able to, open up my camera. I'm so sorry for that. And I'll just begin my presentation now. Is my presentation visible? Is my presentation visible?
I think it's not. Yeah, it is. It is.
Okay.
Now.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll begin. So my topic is rummaging lost identities of partition through fiction. Now, the partition of India and the subsequent migration of thereafter was one of the largest movements of migration in the history of humankind. It was a defining moment that is neither the beginning nor the end. Partition continues to influence how the peoples and states of post-colonial South Asia envisage their past, present, and future. The partition, rather than delimiting itself to 1947, was a seismic process which has affected the citizens, especially the minorities, dissimilarly, and has in turn given birth to a plethora of identities and their categories, which has further embroiled the repercussions of partition. And hence, it is rather unfair to reduce such poignant part of our history into mere political narratives, and thus we shall strive to encompass the individual effect of partition in the microscopic lives, traditions, and minds of the people. Now, bringing on the birth and death of identities, in the brewing spirals of perpetual violence, during which a deep rupture of communities and social structures took place, this historical trauma has left its indelible imprint. A grave decline from the existence of syncretic culture and identities which coax the formation of multifarious communities. The Orientalist manifestation and the cultural appropriation in construction of Indian society and the ruling class interest and the calculation has given a founding base to the partition of India. As Gyanendra Pandey elaborates on the perpetual discomfort of the liberal state to accommodate the plural culture and communities wherein, apart from being an economic entity of productive value, the syncretic communities of a society have a dynamic public presence and valuable ties, and hence argues that perhaps that is why the combination of such mixed societies with the demands of decolonization has often been lethal. The historiography of partition has also been encaged by the shackles of statistics and the constant reduction of complex histories to mere bullet points. The essence of identity plays a crucial role in partition. The culture and the social ambience of people dictates the one's personal sense of self and the identification to such events. Salman Rashid in his memoir addresses the sense of self which transcends the spatial and temporal boundaries and dwells with the consciousness of belonging of the generations that have come before them. Migration is often accompanied by a feeling of unavoidable disorientation. In most cases, it would have created an involuntary distance between where one was born before the partition and where one moved to after it, stretching out their identity sparsely over the expanse of this distance. As a result, somewhere in between the original city of their birth and the adopted city of residence would lay their essence and identity, which was strangely malleable. Coming on to the memory, identity, and trauma, according to Locke's memory theory, person's identity is intrinsically linked to memory, and identity can be traced back to as far as memory permits. Thomas Reid postulated memory not only as the primary ground for identity, but rather an entity through which past becomes immediately and directly accessible, and thus sustains itself in the being of personhood. When examining partition through these conceptual terms, the blood-tainted memories of partition play a defining role in coloring the identities of such partition victims. Benedict Anderson has also contended that collective memory is integral to the formation of social identities, as it imbues a sense of coherence and linkage to the past that is crucial to constructing a shared sense of identity. In this way, the collective memory operates as a form of cultural capital, conferring upon members of a community a set of values, convictions, and traditions that shape their perception of self and their position in society. Thus, an identity embodies a narrative and maybe an origin story, or perchance a recollection of prolonged sequence of traumas and memories. Identity and collective memory are interdependent. Memories, songs, symbols, and folk tales serve to establish reference points in people's history and the collective emotions that a group undergoes. That is how, when an arbitrary boundary is set between the people sharing oneness of a culture, the consequences are death of a former self of being as it is reflected in the lives of the partition victim. Now we begin with the catharsis of fiction. In the paucity of social history addressing the partition, literary works can also be often looked as the surrogate documentation species of historiography to meet the need of comprehensive analysis of social penetration of partition. Fiction offers a myriad of narratives of partition. Through fragmented memories, partition accounts depict often what is the unknowable and what is unspeakable. The trauma of partition is so imbibed in the nature of subsistence that it is hard to separate it and hold its dissemination to the coming generation. As a result, the progeny becomes as much a victim as the witnesses. The authors of partition live through these texts, painting in their homeland, meeting their old friends, and touching their own sense of self in the process. Partition, when experienced through a literary text, becomes tangible, felt, and absorbed, thus making a transition from a memory to a memoir. It can help also to shed light on the fragmentary experiences of the people. Now we talk about the man himself, the Munter of partition. Munter was a writer who employed an acerbic and abrasive style, detailing repugnant and loathsome scenes. His works are strengthened by their refusal to offer any ideological or philosophical remedies to the depicted wretchedness, remaining detached and impartial observers of the hopeless frenzy. As he wrote in Kholdo, a story where a father who asked some social workers to form a search party for his daughter, it turns out that upon finding her, the men go on to rape her themselves and leaving her to die near the refugee camp. The concluding scene, where Sharina lays there conscious in the doctor's office, opening her salwar, expecting to be raped again, is particularly evocative of the trauma of victims whose perpetrators were men within their own communities as often as those of others. As the excerpt from Kholdo is also depicted in the slide itself, the setting evokes a pervasive sense of melancholic pessimism, revealing a landscape where individuals who have lost their homes and families and sense of self wander resembling corpses searching for respite from their anguish. Caught under the tide of humanity lie the humans engulfed in monstrous instincts. They engage in acts of predation, intrusion, and sexual violence, transgressing rudimentary values of their society. These individuals display a level of bestial ferocity that enables them to surpass their religious and political identities as well as their humanity, underscoring the barbaric nature of the world we inhabit. The gruesome reality of partition is the loss of identity where desperation is the norm. Now we also move to the other facet of partition, which is the landscape of the change. As Edward Said has mentioned, for the native, the history of colonial servitude is inaugurated by the loss of locality to the outsider. Its geographical identity must thereafter be searched for and somehow restored. As Simon Sharma also mentioned, Bengal is a landscape of writing about the Bengal
Sorry to
partition.
interrupt. Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your uh, the slides, it's not
Yeah.
working, I guess.
Okay,
We can still see the introduction slide.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you still see it?
Yes, we can see it, but we can see just the introduction slide.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Should I just start sharing again? Wait.
Yeah, sure.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay, I'm so sorry for that. So yeah, as Edward Said has said, for the natives, the history of colonial servitude is inaugurated by the loss of locality to the outsider, and its geographical identity must thereafter be searched for and somehow be restored. Writing about the Bengal partition, Simon Sharma has also said that Bengal is a landscape of the mind, and its scenery is built upon as much from the strata of memory as from the layers of rock. Also, I've mentioned the excerpt from The Remnants of Partition by Achal Malhotra, where she talks about the division of landscape in the partition paradigm, where even the water was divided between the Hindu Pani and the Muslim Pani. In the small narration from this Remnants of Partition, the division of landscape and the natural resources uses a term called anthropomorphizing in describing the landscape, emphasizes the emotional impact of leaving one's home and the trauma of displacement. Anthropomorphizing involves attributing human characteristics or emotions to non-human entities such as the landscape. By doing so, it can help to create a more vivid and emotional picture of the situation. The contrast between the timeless status of rural life and the modern industrial forms of transport used by refugees to leave their home further emphasizes the disruption and trauma caused by the displacement. This contrast continuously highlights the loss of stability and security that comes with being uprooted from one's familiar surroundings and forced to adopt to a new and unfamiliar environment. Now, for conclusion, my primary point for conclusion is that we need to value the cultural and individual memories while writing such moving histories of such historical events, as fiction and literary movements and works define what humans are in their roots and foundational level. Thus, we need to understand the historical events as the part of human stories that are lived, shared, felt through the social histories of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Snigdha. Is there any questions? Are there any questions from amongst the audience, of the people present?
I think there are none as of now.
All right, all right. Okay, thank you, Snigdha. That's a really interesting presentation when you're talking about partition and partition literature. That I hope I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am, you are.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Yeah, the literature around partition, it's very interesting because the way you've dealt with it, you try to comment that how partition is something that is still, maybe still the effects of partition are felt in present generation as well, because certain historical events like clear the fabric of history to a very in a very deep manner, and also the way in which those historical events are analyzed and remembered is also something that affects the present. And in saying where you talked about how progeny is also as much as a victim, I found a very interesting like comparison, or very interesting similarity, I'll say, rather than comparison, with the Bishi's paper, where she's talking about intergenerational trauma and how even though the generation that is writing the text has not experienced the trauma, the war or the partition in your case, still the trauma remains there in some form or another. And Debeshi approves, I think. She says, yeah, she noticed that as well. In your work, I couldn't understand if you have looked only at Manto or if you have looked at any other authors like, say, Kushwant Singh or any other author, writer.
Yes, actually, I did look through a lot of them, like Manto, Kushwant Singh, then there's Bhisham Sahani, then a lot of recent authors as well as like Aanchal Malhotra. She wrote about material memory of partition. That was really intriguing. So actually, I couldn't put them in the slides because of the limited time, because I wanted to also
Okay.
explain the conceptual terms. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Snigdha, and you have looked at both fictional and non-fictional works when you're looking at those, when you're for your literature for this particular paper.
Yes,
Fictional and
primarily.
non-fictional both.
Yes, I was researching on the fiction part, but to gain that trajectory, I had to go through the non-fiction as well.
Because you keep mentioning the aspect of social history and how, first audience, social history is something that is defined and very well developed field of study that historians pursue, and like social history is something that can be when you look at partition, what is the social history of partition is something that we will pursue, but there will be certain different parameters that we would be looking at. So you can also go ahead and read upon the certain scholars, certain historians who have worked on social history primarily. And I'll just conclude with this one comment, since you're talking about loss of home or loss of watan or loss of an identity. Post-partition, because there were new identities that were being formed and new identities that were being imposed rather on a group of people. So I was just reminded of Rajmohan Gandhi's work. You can also refer to that if you're interested. He wrote a work. He's written a lot of books, but this one was on the history of Punjab specifically. And in that work, in the first few pages, he mentions how in the earlier times when people used to ask, who are you? Or who, like when you're asked about your identity, the first thing that came to their mind was their village. So their identity was their watan, which is technically the village which they belonged to. Even today, when you look at like two generations, probably two generations earlier, our grandparents, they would always use the term watan in a way which would mean a village to which they belong to. And that kind of identity was something that was very prominent at a particular point of time. But over time, religion and other identities probably were we were told to be identified with those certain identities. This was obviously a result of, say, the colonization and the colonial attempt at dividing the Indians, and also probably because of the communalism that was growing at the time when the partition took place. So these are the comments that I will make. I hope they will help you develop your paper further. Thank you, Snigdha. I'm not sure if there are any questions. If not, we can move to the next paper.
Thank you, ma'am. We have our fifth presentation titled Foreign Correspondence Reports at the Journalistic Gaze, Interrogating the Representation of Sepoy Mutiny 1857 by the Times. And the paper is presented by Sarbondea Haldar.
Hi, good evening. I hope I'm audible and visible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, just a second. I will present the PPT. Could you please confirm if the PPT is visible?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Then I'll start. Good evening. I'm Srabondea Haldar, a final year undergraduate history student of Shivnadar Institution of Eminence, and I shall be presenting my paper titled Foreign Correspondent Reports and the Journalistic Gaze, Interrogating the Representation of the Sepoy Mutiny 1857 by the Times. The events of the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 and the blatant challenge it posed to colonial authority in India had captured the public imagination of Britain. The mutiny fundamentally altered colonial authority in India with the dissolution of the East India Company and the imposition of Crown Rule in 1858. Further, it necessitated a reworking of the colonial worldview in Britain. Prior to the mutiny, the East India Company officials were engaged in the process of producing knowledge of Indian society by gaining a command of language for economic, political, and military purposes. This information became the foundation on which the people in Britain conceptualized the Indian colony, the colonial subjecthood of the natives, and their own colonial identity within the empire. However, the mutiny necessitated a reworking of the hierarchical relationship between British colonial identity and Indian colonial subjecthood within the empire. This gave rise to significant anxiety within the metropole. The question that arises is, how did the people in Britain receive, understand, and respond to the news of the mutiny? A major source of information regarding the mutiny was journalistic reports published in British newspapers. Soon after Britain received its first correspondence about the outbreak in May 1857, the mutiny was a regularly debated feature in the pages of its newspapers. Victorian journalism played an important role in shaping the empire as experienced by the metropole. However, there is a need to understand how the metropole constructed and presented a coherent narrative of the mutiny. This paper aims to critically analyze the narrativization of the Sepoy Mutiny within the Victorian journalistic public sphere by focusing on the Times, the leading British daily newspaper in the 19th century, from the onset of the mutiny in May 1857 to the imposition of Crown Rule in India in November of 1858. It aims to understand how the Times reconciled the threat posed by the mutiny to the empire and assuage the anxiety regarding the same in the metropole. Finally, it aims to understand how the Times articulated the British colonial identity vis-a-vis the Indian colonial subjecthood within the empire when faced by the imperial crisis of the Sepoy Mutiny. The mutiny was one of the first conflicts of imperial significance to be covered by press reporters in the field. The Times played a leading role in reporting the events of the mutiny within Britain. The Times is not a passive part of the great system of circulation wherein knowledge was produced, meaning was made, and information circulated between India and Britain in the 19th century. Rather, it actively created the empire as experienced by the metropole. This was clearly seen in the segment of the Times newspaper titled Foreign Correspondence Reports. It became a dominant voice regarding matters of the mutiny based on eyewitness reports it received from Bombay and Kolkata. Although some of these correspondence were directly published, others became the basis on which a number of articles were written. Thus, these foreign correspondences became an integral part of the archive and the public memory of the imperial crisis. One must view the news published by the Times as cultural entities that entered almost every household and created a sense of the empire, the colony, and the imperial identity. The initial information received regarding the mutiny in Britain were eyewitness reports received from India. These reports were then transformed by the Times into a language of popular appeal, creating the rhetoric of empire. Thus, the reality of the empire was, as experienced by the metropole, was produced by Victorian journalism. Journalism itself was intrinsically connected to the project of empire building. By the 19th century, there was a transnational communication system consisting of steamship mail services and telegraphic systems which enabled the circulation of news from the colony to the metropole. Journalism played an important role in creating a hierarchical relationship between the metropole and the colony within the empire. Further, journalism was distinguished from fiction based on the idea of news as being grounded in visual observation and historical actuality. The journalist was endowed with the gaze, an instrument of order in a system of authority and surveillance that underpinned the relationship between the metropole and the colony. However, the question that arises is what happens to the authoritative journalistic gaze during an imperial crisis such as the mutiny? The analysis of the foreign correspondence reports published by the Times regarding the mutiny makes evident that the colonial journalistic gaze was neither singular nor static. Rather, it was dynamic and multifaceted. There is a need to interrogate who possessed the journalistic gaze within the colony. As the mutiny progressed, Britain received more information about the uprising, generating more and more anxiety within the metropole. The Times, as a hegemonic source of information regarding the mutiny, played an important role in creating a narrative of the mutiny that aimed at containing this anxiety. It strengthened the opinion of the mutiny as being of military concern. It propagated the argument that the new cartridges of the Enfield rifles were not greased with the fat of pigs and cows, and thus no harm was intended to the caste or religion of the sepoys, making the mutiny a senseless violence enacted by sepoys on the Europeans. Thus, the Times played an important role in articulating a mutually constituted hierarchical relationship between British colonial identity and Indian colonial subjecthood during the imperial crisis. To assuage the anxiety of the metropole, the Times began publishing personal letters that were written by British individuals witnessing the mutiny in different parts of India. These letters became a major part of the Times's reportage of the mutiny and the public memory of the imperial crisis in Britain. The decision to publish these personal letters in newspapers is a very interesting phenomenon, as it endowed the personal letter with the importance of news and endowed its authors with the journalistic gaze. Additionally, this phenomenon fundamentally unsettles the idea of a singular British experience in the colony. There is a need to interrogate who had the authority to write about the mutiny and how did they experience the imperial crisis. In my research, I have found four main groups of individuals who are writing about the mutiny, namely soldiers, doctors, women, and the clergy. The soldiers were individuals who were actively fighting against the rebelling sepoys, and the most number of letters that were received and published by the Times were written by soldiers. The letters were often gave a unique insight into the ground reality of the battles being fought. Further, it highlighted that the British soldiers' experience of the mutiny was deeply influenced by their interactions with Indian ideas and beliefs. For instance, many soldiers believed that the mutiny was a war of extermination, as they were influenced by the local prophecy of the termination of the British Raj on the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Plassey. Further, these letters played an important role in shaping the image of the sepoy in the minds of the people in Britain. For instance, while describing the battle on 27th June, Major Cobb describes the sepoy as being barbarous people who made themselves quite drunk with a native drug called bhang, which consecutively made them more courageous than usual. Further, soldiers often call the mutiny a situation of life and death. They feared the natives and found comfort in European encampments. Thus, the experience of the British soldier is fundamentally constituted in opposition to the figure of the sepoy. The second group of individuals were doctors and medical officials associated with the British regiment. Most of these individuals were not soldiers. However, the abrupt onset of the mutiny forced them to take up arms. A medical officer in Gwalior mentioned that this was the first time he had been in action. Nonetheless, he considered it prudent to give them, the sepoy, a battle. Many doctors were separated from their regiments once the violence began. For instance, a surgeon of the 74th Native Infantry was cornered by the sepoys. And during this time, he appealed to the sepoys by speaking in Hindustani and praising Prophet Muhammad. Due to his use of native language and the appeal to religion, he was spared.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's a gentle reminder that you have to wind up your presentation within 2 minutes.
Right, sure. So he took refuge in the villages of ironsmiths, where he was welcomed because he was a Firangi doctor and not a British soldier. Thus, the doctor's experience of the mutiny was influenced by their knowledge of language and medicine, and thus the British experience of the mutiny was defined by the position they held in the colony. The accounts to have perhaps the most impact on the psyche of the people of Britain were accounts written by women. Most of the women in the colony were wives and daughters of British officials working for the East India Company. During the mutiny, the sepoys often stormed into British houses and hence the private sphere and threatened women and children. One woman in Agra recounts that the sepoy came into the compound and pushed all women and into a little hut where they all crowded in and threatened the women with death or worse than death. These accounts generated much anger in the metropole, as it narrates the audacity of the sepoy to threaten British women and the fabric of British civility. This was supplemented by the accounts written by the clergy. The clergy and missionary workers were among the first to be evacuated from the scenes of violence. Still, some of them became victims of the sepoy. The murder of the clergy by the sepoys was seen as a direct challenge to the religion and the moral character of the empire. Further, the religious tones of the accounts played an important role in conceptualizing the sepoy as barbaric and demonic. Further, it generated a public demand in the metropole for violent retributions towards the sepoy. Interestingly, by publishing the private letters, the Times played a crucial role in highlighting the multiplicity of British experiences in the mutiny. A critical analysis of the foreign correspondence reports allows one to interrogate the colonial common sense in the changing imperial order, in which social reforms, questions of rights and representations, and racial exclusion played an important role. Interestingly, the decision of the Times to publish letters allowed it to visualize the empire in India and represent it in its newspaper. Prior to the mutiny, the Times received information regarding the colony from Bombay and Calcutta. However, with the onset of the mutiny, the Times began receiving information from more and more regions in India. Take, for instance, this particular page published on 14th August 1857. The Times published information regarding the mutiny coming from Agra, Gwalior, Nagpur, Bareilly, Faizabad, etc. By publishing news received from these different parts of the colony, the Times was able to bring these regions into the imperial consciousness of the people in the metropole. Thus, the Times played an important role in conceptualizing, visualizing, and representing the empire in India to the people of the metropole.
Kindly wrap up soon.
Yeah, so just the concluding statement then, by doing so, the Times not only registered a loss of colonial authority in India, it created a collective consciousness of the trauma and the violence of the mutiny, and it also actively reworked the idea of colonial authority in India, which then defined the relationship between the empire, the metropole, and the colony for the next 100 years. So thank you. That is what I in my presentation.
Thank you, Srabondia. Finally, a fellow historian or a student of history. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation, a very intriguing one indeed. And I'll just make a few quick comments, and then I'll expect, meanwhile, this the audience would be writing their questions or preparing their articulating their questions, right? So when you're talking about, say, this particular mutiny of 1857, and as a historian, we all know that the mutiny of 1857 might be seen as a great setback or a great fault on part of the British, right? So they did something wrong for that to happen. People, for sepoys to revolt and come up against the ruling elite. Was like, it's just as like, I'm thinking out loud, you can like comment and add or whatever. So were these like, journalistic pieces, were these articles an attempt at shifting the the narrative of the public sphere, since the audience of those articles is definitely the British public, the British people, right, that you have referred to again and again in your presentation. So was this attempt by the the people at fault to try to change the narrative and make it about try to gain sympathy from the public, from the British public, so that they can cover up the kind of faults that were done on their part, the kind of oppressive practices that eventually led to the people revolting? So okay, if you can just.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and of course, like I've thought about it as well. The thing that I find is that the Times is a hegemonic voice. It received information first, before sometimes even before the Parliament itself. Also, it would be erroneous to assume that Times was without its own political alignments. So it was very pro-Parliament, not so much the conservative. And while it does try to create what David Spur calls the rhetoric of empire. It creates the hegemonic idea of what the empire should be and what your public opinion as the subject of the British Empire should be, as the colonizer, of course. There is a sort of creation of this idea of pro-empire, and there's also a negation of other opinions that were held. So we have Lord Canning and of course Disraeli, who are talking pro-sepoys or sort of pro-India, and they were actively criticized by the Times.
Kindly wrap up soon. We are running out of time.
So yeah, it does create a hegemonic voice and a hegemonic opinion within the metropole.
Thank you, Shabondya. Sana, I will take just 3 more minutes, I think. I will just give my concluding remarks and I'll just make a suggestion to Shabondya. I don't know if you're aware, you must be aware, I think, of this work written by Durgadas Bandyopadhyay. It was a work that was composed during the mutiny, and it was Sepoy who wrote that particular work, and he is a loyalist. He's a loyalist Sepoy, and he's giving an eyewitness account of that particular, like, you know, whatever is happening, the incidents, how things are moving. So you can also refer to that, and, like, you know, to add to your literature, and to see how you can compare that text and the how things are perceived in that text, and then you know, compare that to the letters that were written or the, like, journalistic pieces that were written. That work has been translated by Cathy Caruth. It's easily available, so you can, like, go through that. Okay, Shabondya, thank you. I'll just, Sana, if time allows, I'll just conclude the session.
Thank you. Now let us take a moment to applaud the incredible paper reading conference we just witnessed. The depth of knowledge, insightful analysis, and thought-provoking ideas presented by our esteemed speakers has truly left us inspired and enriched. We extend our heartfelt appreciation to each of our presenters for their diligent research, articulate delivery, and engaging presentations. Dedication to your respective fields of study and your passion for sharing knowledge have made this conference a resounding success. We are truly privileged to have had Dr. Lubna Irfan grace this occasion with their esteemed presence. We extend our deepest appreciation for their graciousness, humility, and willingness to share their time and expertise. Their presence has truly elevated the significance of this event, and we are immensely grateful for their invaluable contributions. I now request our chairperson, Dr. Lubna Irfan, to share her thoughts with us. We are confident that the words will enlighten, inspire, and motivate us to reach greater heights in our own endeavors.
Thank you, Sana, for hoping so much from me. I'll just quickly conclude and just, like, you know, give you what I got from this particular panel. Since the panel talks, like, it was beautifully tied together with a few presentations which were very connected to each other. So kudos to the organizers for clubbing these interesting papers together. And I think what the panel does, it explores these fault lines or ruptures that exist in the fabric of, say, mainstream history, which can be filled by these literary works, this literature, this fiction, and these fictional works can be used as means of understanding and recording of realities maybe which might have been missed by historical recorders, because for a long time the positivist historians have been like, you know, we have been, like, very adamant at saying that fiction or literature cannot be used as a valid source of history, something that has been written in a non-fictional manner, something that has facts and records facts is something that is supposed to be history, and that can be used as a source of history. But interestingly, we, like, the earliest literary work, be it Odyssey, or be it the Jataka tales or the mythological tales like Ramayana and Mahabharata, they have been utilized by historians time and again to, you know, set the historical compass right, or to, like, you know, develop the kind of cultural narrative that, like, to unearth the kind of cultural narrative that might have been there, and to place these literary texts within the historical context. So history and literature is something that are completely interlinked and intertwined. And when we talk about memory is something that relates to both literature and history in a very interesting manner, in a very integral manner, if I can say so. Because the most, for example, if you see that monument, it literally means in memory of something, in memory of some particular incident or person or a particular historical event. So I got much to learn from this panel. Thank you so much to all the presenters for letting us know about different facets of researches that are going on, and these researches which are also interdisciplinary in a manner, since they look at historical realities and relate them to the literary works that have been composed. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me and for honoring me to for chairing this session. And I learned a lot, and I hope I was able to make certain valuable contributions to all of your papers, and I hope to see your works published soon. Thank you. Thank you, Sana, for beautifully conducting the program.
Thank you, ma'am. Harshit here says, thanks a lot, Dr. Irfan. I really enjoyed listening to my fellow presenters, and especially your critical insights. And Deveshi here also thanks you. Thank you for your valuable insights and everything. As we conclude this remarkable evening, I would like to finally acknowledge the efforts of the performers, the creative team, and everyone involved in making this event a resounding success. And thank you all for being a part of this event.